Good evening, and welcome to Pressing Issues. Today is Sunday, April 26, 2020. I am Jason Diffendahl, and I'll be your host for an evening of discussion about Walt Disney World and other things, all things Disney related, basically. But I think for this one, we're going to concentrate a lot on Walt Disney World and a bit of Disneyland. I'd like to introduce my panel for this evening. We have Jill Diffendahl.
Not so much at the moment, I don't think.
Frozen. She's a bit frozen. She was here. We have Allison Shee.
Good evening, everyone. What a lovely introduction. I love the music leading into this show.
Isn't the music great? I love the music, too. I think it's fantastic.
It's lovely.
And we have Rich Grafton back this week.
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Rich. Rich is sitting in the hub somewhere.
I wish. In spirit.
Yes. And Jill will appear in the upper right-hand corner there at some point as soon as she gets connected back with us. But today's episode, we're going to talk about several things, but I think the most important after developments this week is the potential plans for the phased reopening at Walt Disney World. We have seen some existing plans that Shanghai has put into place to potentially reopen Shanghai Disneyland. They have put marks on the pavement to show a 6-foot or something thereabout social distancing guidelines for queues, and the Florida governor has said that it appears that Orlando is somewhat beyond the peak of coronavirus infections, so it's conceivable that Walt Disney World in Florida might reopen maybe within the next, I don't know, month and a half or so. As we told you last week, Disney is taking reservations starting June 1st for resort stays at Walt Disney World. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the state will allow them to reopen by June 1st. Anyway, we do know that Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida has been in communication with Disney and obviously other parks. As you all know, the major theme parks in Orlando are a huge driver of revenue for Florida, and it's a huge tourist destination. And so certainly one of the governor's main objective is to get tourists to come back to Florida, and that involves reopening all the theme parks. They've started reopening the beaches, which will get some tourists to Florida, but those tourists don't include me. I do like the beaches, but I'm not going to come to Florida until the theme parks are reopened, most likely. There has been some information leaked from some Disney insiders that there's a protocol that they have planned for when the phased reopening can start. And this is for Walt Disney World. Disneyland has its own situation, and it looks like Disneyland might not reopen very soon. At least Florida is estimated to open sooner than Disneyland. But of course, there will be significant restrictions, limitations on what is possible at Walt Disney World, and this is what is being called the Secure Circuit Protocol. It sounds like an Epcot name to me, but I don't know what this has to do with circuits or security for that matter. But that's what they're calling this, the Secure Circuit Protocol. For the phased reopening of Walt Disney World. And so I'll go through a couple of things that are sort of the high level idea here, and then we can certainly discuss in further detail. But the plan is the Magic Kingdom would reopen with limited capacity, but there would be no theater shows which means Mickey's PhilharMagic wouldn't be running, Carousel of Progress wouldn't be running. The idea, a Country Bear Jamboree wouldn't be running. The idea is that anything that has guests sort of stationary in close proximity for a period of time is not going to be ideal for prevention of the spread of coronavirus. So no theaters, and likewise no parades. Certainly guests sitting or standing on the sidewalks waiting for a parade is, again, too many guests in close proximity. So there will be no parades, and similarly no castle stage shows. And along the same lines, no fireworks. So it appears like the goal is to get the rides reopened, but a lot of the ancillary entertainment, which involves guests waiting in a fixed position for a period of time, are not going to be operational at the very beginning. And of course, the plan is to sanitize ride vehicles after every guest exits the vehicle. So that's the Magic Kingdom plan. The Magic Kingdom resorts would reopen with some restrictions in terms of social distancing, but what those restrictions are, we don't really know. But the monorails would not operate. So it looks like people who are staying at one of the Magic Kingdom resorts would have to find either boat transportation or maybe bus transportation would run in place of monorails. Monorails would not operate as part of the phased reopening, but they barely operate when things are running normal, so that's not a huge surprise. So ferries and boat transportation would operate from the Magic Kingdom resorts to the Magic Kingdom. And in addition to the security checks, the bag checks, and the metal detectors, there would be temperature checks of all guests, and some questioning in terms of locations that guests have traveled to in the past 14 days. So what would exactly happen if you had a temperature of 100 or 101 or 102 is not known at this point. And also what would happen if you said, oh, I was in Tokyo Disneyland last week. What that means in terms of whether they would permit you admission to the Magic Kingdom is unknown. Certainly at this point in time, the United States is one of the less safe countries in terms of the spread of coronavirus. So maybe as long as you say you've been in a different country in the past 14 days, they would usher you right in. I don't know. But that's this is all part of the Secure Circuit Protocol. Also, as part of this protocol, guests would have to sign some legal form to agree to not sue Disney if they ended up contracting coronavirus. So that seems, logical. Although there's plenty of restrictions and waivers that every guest makes just by using an admission ticket. So this whole thing of signing an additional legal paper, I don't know. That kind of threw me as something that seems a little bit out there in terms of this reopening protocol. But the other thing that's really interesting with this is that if other parks are able to open prior to September, then Epcot would remain closed. So even if the Magic Kingdom and Studios and Animal Kingdom are able to reopen this summer, Epcot would remain closed through at least September. So say goodbye to the remainder of the Flower and Garden Festival and the beginning of the Food and Wine Festival, for that matter. So all those things would be presumably canceled, and we don't know anything about any other plans going forward at Epcot, such as the Spaceship Earth refurbishment that was supposed to take place starting at the end of May. Excuse me. As part of this phase reopening, Hollywood studios would reopen. No theaters, no parades, no fireworks. Animal Kingdom would reopen. No theaters, no parades, no rivers of light. And certain animal encounters at Animal Kingdom would remain closed, just because of the goal to keep guests distant from the animals. Presumably, not much is known about the animals at Animal Kingdom and how they would fare with exposure to coronavirus. So, restricting animal contact makes quite a bit of sense there. That's basically the details that we know in terms of how this phased reopening of Walt Disney World would happen. Also part of this plan, water parks would not reopen. And whether masks would be a requirement or not, we don't know. Magic bands would presumably be required, but the fingerprinting would likely be waived for entry to the parks. And it's likely that the only resorts that would open under Secure Circuit Protocol would be the Magic Kingdom resorts. No other resorts would open. So that's basically what we know in terms of this reopening protocol that Disney is apparently working on at the moment to enable a phased reopening. And so I just want to turn it over to the panel to hear what you guys have to say.
A couple things off of, you said 3 times, Secure Circuit Protocol is the plan. So maybe it is. It's a quote-unquote leak. It's not an official source. And it may, in fact, be part of the planning that Walt Disney behind the closed doors is doing right now. But I would bet that in the couple of weeks since this was discovered, things have changed, because it's as people have said all the time, it's a very fluid situation. So it does make sense that you open maybe 1, maybe 2 parks and focus on those and test things out, try things out, see how easy it is or not to control crowds and sanitize rides and things like that. But I just want to caution that this is still unofficial, and it might have already changed. We're obviously going to talk about it because all these things make sense, but I just want to make that point, if I may.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. This Secure Circuit Protocol plan is a leak from someone, presumably within the Walt Disney Company. Who knows? This may be one of 12 different plans they had in place, or it could be a plan that they had in place that they've decided to get rid of and come up with something totally different. It does seem to make a lot of sense. Some parts of it seem to make a lot of sense.
Agreed.
But of course, yes, this should all be treated as speculation at this point, because we don't actually know anything official. And we have no idea when any of this would happen either. So this is
right.
This is what we are, receiving as some leaked plans, but no one knows for sure how much, if any, of this would actually happen.
I'm fascinated by the use of liability waivers, or potentially using these for guests coming in. So I think it could easily backfire because if you're having somebody sign away their ability to have some recourse, then they're going to trust traveling to Disney World less and maybe not want to go. And then you're having a huge problem with attendance, which you're going to have anyway, because a lot of people are not going to be comfortable traveling. And then on the other side of it, I'm fascinated because Disney World as a company owes a duty not just to the guests that come in, but they also owe a duty to their employees and to the cast members that work there. And a lot of those people are, understandably, and after being furloughed, are going to be very desperate to come back to work. And there's been talk about legislation federally or an executive order to eliminate liability for employers, their employees or with their customers. And it almost seems unconscionable to me to have something like that, but it's also like feasibly that could do even more harm economically, because you have people who are afraid to work for certain places or afraid to come into certain places.
Yeah,
sure.
Agreed. When we were doing rock climbing, we would always sign a waiver that said, hey, listen, people have died a lot from this very particular activity, so you will not hold us responsible, but it is my choice to go and climb a rock face. Similarly, and that definitely cut down the number of people who would even want to do that sort of thing. So I would agree that is going to be part of the equation, let's say for my family, as to when and how and who would go to Disney as time progresses. It's, what if we already waive some of liability when we buy a ticket as it is, although there are limitations both at the federal and state and county levels on that. This is something new and different that nobody's done yet. So it'll be interesting to see what happens from the guest perception as to, well, as long as they have to sign a liability, it isn't safe, so I'm not going, like you said. That could definitely be a case.
Right. I want to trust that they are sanitizing the cars down every single time you're getting on and off a ride. And if you're like, oh, I signed this form, maybe they're not doing these things that they're saying.
Well, I mean, there's so certainly is.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, there certainly is so many examples of Disney not doing things they're supposed to be doing, regardless of whether it has to do with coronavirus or not. Yeah, surprise, surprise, right? Like, hey, maintenance. But even right before Walt Disney World closed, when they had said, they were sanitizing the fingerprint readers after every guest, that clearly didn't happen all of the time. So the other question is, even if you sign a waiver, usually waivers don't absolve the company of negligence claims. So if the company has policies and procedures in place that they're going to sanitize ride vehicles, and then they didn't, that, certainly you didn't necessarily waive your rights if the company didn't do what they were supposed to be doing in terms of guest safety. I mean, you do waive certain rights when you buy and use a ticket, but if it, and has happened in the past, Disney's lack of maintenance or lack of oversight has caused people to die, and those whatever waivers came attached with your ticket were not in play simply because it was shown that Disney itself was not following their policies for guest safety. So, if they're supposed to wipe down the ride vehicles and they don't, are you waiving any rights to sue them later? That whole legal thing is going to be really interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, typically in courts, they don't like to punish companies for taking more of a duty than they should, and maybe if they fall a little short of the exceptional duty, the exceptional level of care that they set for themselves, they don't want to be punished if they don't follow that to the T. So I think as long as Disney is following like the broad things that are expected by the government of Florida, then it would be hard to bring a negligence claim with people signing these waivers. So it's possible that wiping down the ride vehicles would fall into that, oh, this is like an extraordinary level, they're doing more than they need to do. And if that's the cause of the contact or the cause of the outbreak, then it would be hard to win a suit based on that. But it's, this whole thing is like unlike anything we've ever seen before. So it's just so hard to see it play out. And I think the biggest thing that Disney needs to do is to shore up trust with their guests in order to bring everyone back. And the first thing that they're going to ask people to do is sign waivers. It doesn't seem like it'll do that.
Yeah, that's very true. There's also we as a world really don't know the full extent of how the virus actually interacts with our human bodies completely. We know that there's activity in the lungs and in the pleural sacs and in the chest. But what else is it doing? There's, there may be an immunocompromise side to it. There may be a circulatory system activation that is happening. If I put on the medical scientist hat, there's lots of bits and pieces of news that 15 people did this without explanation, except they all had a virus positive, and these 20 people all had this weird thing happen, and the only common thing is they had virus positive. But there's no causal relationship. It's all correlation, but it begs the question or points out that we still have a lot of unknowns when it comes to the life cycle behavior and interaction of the virus with us. So there will have to be some risk taking on everyone's side if we get the economy moving, which of course overall, not just Disney, but everybody is one of the determination factors, I hope, as to when the economy starts to open up is, when do we know enough? Certainly prevention measures are a big part of that, and sanitizing the ride vehicles. I mean, in my head, how would you coordinate sanitizing a ride? I don't think you could do a sanitizing on the boats of Small World or Pirates, but you might be able to do sanitizing. Pretty
difficult, right?
Yeah, you might be able to do sanitizing on like the haunted house maybe, and you put one person in every other car, and the cars that don't have a guest in it have a cleaner in it, and they just go through the whole ride cleaning the car and then get off, and that's the car of the next guest. Yeah, I don't know. There are lots of ways you could do it, but they would have to have a very low attendance. Otherwise, they'd have 3-hour lines, which would kind of defeat the whole purpose of keeping everybody separate.
So that's kind of where I wanted to go with this discussion is, certainly in terms of Walt Disney World as a functional profit-making enterprise, there are certain economies of scale that have to be in place. So in order to run the Magic Kingdom, you need a minimum number of cast members, and then you have, the more crowded it gets, the more cast members you need for certain facets. But there's definitely a bottom line minimum to run the park, and with reduced attendance or limited attendance or distancing measures where you only put guests in every other ride vehicle, those kinds of things, there's going to be issues where it certainly could be that Disney's still not making money, right? Like they would be losing less than they are with everything closed, but it may still be difficult to make any amount of money with a Magic Kingdom that is only able to accommodate 10,000 people instead of a typical day of 40 or 60,000 or whatever. So that's another really interesting thing to think about is how can Disney function as an enterprise? I mean, same thing with like dining, right? Like Disney obviously makes a lot of money on dining, but if the restaurants can only be seated, every other table to maintain your social distance between parties in a restaurant, you still have to have kitchen staff and you still have to have wait staff, maybe not as many, but there's definitely less profit margin when restaurants and rides and parks are half full or less than half full. So, I think we'll all be happy when some parts of Walt Disney World reopen, but whether that enables the company to actually make some money or they're still going to be losing money, that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I mean, certainly it's clear, like, not opening any resorts except the Magic Kingdom resorts is a way to sort of mitigate that. I mean, I think in terms of like social distancing in hotels, I mean, you're in your own room, so when you're in your room, it doesn't matter how distant you are. I know people have speculated before, like, well, you could only, put people in every other room in a hotel. That's not going to actually make any difference. As long as, people aren't lined up for the elevator or whatnot, which sometimes happens at certain times. But for the most part, it's not the room situation in the hotel, it's the restaurant situation or the front desk or whatever, where people sort of congregate, that is going to be a much bigger issue than how many rooms are filled with guests. I think we might have Jill back. Is Jill back?
Oh, yay.
I think I'm back. I think I'm here.
Yay.
Hey, there she is.
Yay.
Sorry about that.
Right, so,
Massive, like 7 different technical issues all at once. I'm really sorry.
All at once, not including the
Yes.
pipes.
No, that's not a technical issue. That's a mechanical issue, a plumbing issue. I don't know.
Hydraulic issue.
There you go. So we were just talking about the secure circuit protocol and phased reopenings and stuff, and how, how things are going to be different, but also like how feasible is it to have a ride, that has 25% of its capacity. If the Magic Kingdom is restricted to 25% of normal capacity, but then every ride is restricted to 25% of normal capacity, that's still going to be hour-long lines for, Seven Dwarfs Mine Train. So how do you accommodate an hour-long line with social distancing in place and things like that?
Yeah, and I think the point you made is probably what I think would be the biggest concern is you can allow enough people into the park, like a limited number of people into the park, to be able to maintain social distancing. And, if there's hour-long lines, I know they've been going in and looking at how to, manage social distancing in queues. But at some point, you said they might make more money. It's actually technically possible that they could operate at an even higher loss, because right now you don't have staff costs, you don't have cast member costs, you don't have electricity cost or water cost or anything like that to keep the park running. If you're opening the park, your expenses are suddenly skyrocketing to accommodate the opening of the park. And if you don't have enough guests in there to even, break even on that, you could theoretically be losing more money. And I think the concern is the low number of people they will need to bring into the park to be able to maintain social distancing and every other ride vehicle or whatever it is they're trying to do could be losing Disney even more money if they reopen the parks.
That's a really good point, and also along those same lines, I mean, there's gonna have to be some steep discounting of hotels and whatnot to get people to actually come. I mean, there's already the free dining offer that's out there, so that means that the restaurants are going to make no money and be a loss leader, actually. So if hotels are steeply discounted and restaurants are giving away free food, that's not really a huge profit center either then. So yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I will say the other thing I was thinking, I heard Allison talking about, the idea of undermining guest confidence with the whole idea of basically signing a waiver to release Disney of liability if you contract coronavirus in the park. And I understand, I completely agree that it will, to some extent, what you've got to do right now is bolster confidence to get people there. However, Disney's not doing this in a vacuum. And from my understanding, I know, Georgia is starting to open things. And there's a lot of places that are, like, they've talked on the news about the idea of other places requiring waivers. If you go to the salon and want to get your hair cut, you need to sign a waiver because a individually owned salon somewhere can't afford a coronavirus lawsuit. So I think there's that element too of recognizing that Disney is not doing this in a vacuum. And if Disney starts making people sign waivers, Disney is not going to be the first company, especially in an environment with the environment that they have, where they're bringing in a whole lot of people into one place. I don't think they're going to be the first the first company to make people sign waivers. I think if anything, they're going to look at trends of what other businesses who are opening first are doing. And if everyone's doing it and it sort of becomes the new socially accepted norm, then they're going to do it. But if they're the only ones doing it, then yes, I think it's absolutely going to undermine confidence. But I would bet a lot of money that they're not going to be the only ones, and they're certainly not going to be the first ones to do it.
Here's another question in terms of waivers and stuff. How difficult is it going to be to prove that you contracted coronavirus at Walt Disney World? I mean, even if you're there for
Impossible.
2 weeks straight and don't leave the parks, right? Like, you're staying at Contemporary and all you do is you walk to the Magic Kingdom every day for 2 weeks. Maybe you could prove that you got coronavirus at Walt Disney World, but it'd still be pretty difficult to prove that. So in that regard, signing a waiver is like, well, it's almost something that it would seem to me Disney could defend pretty easily those types of lawsuits anyway.
Right. I think that's
even if you're a
true.
local,
I think.
Even if you're a local, even if you're a local, you might stop at a gas station, or certainly if you're not local, you probably are going to fly. So it would be very hard to pinpoint your exposure and where you were when you were exposed.
Well, and I was just going to ask a question for you, Allison. Is there any sort of precedent for this where one person gives another?
I think.
It's Jennifer Vader.
Internet. She's having some internet issues.
I think there's probably very little precedent for much, but I think with a civil case, the burden is not like it is in a criminal case, which is how my brain generally operates because that's my area of law. But it's going to be almost impossible to prove that, you contracted coronavirus at Walt Disney World. What will complicate it is if there's an outbreak, a known outbreak, and things are traceable, and Disney knows where you are at all times and where everybody else is at all times. And so through the discovery process, you can figure stuff out, and then you'll also see if there were lapses in protocols and like standards of care in those areas. And that's how one of these cases will progress through. And maybe in the end, go ahead.
You also mentioned about some legislation at the federal level, maybe, eliminating people's rights to sue employee. Like, that's employee rights to sue for contracting coronavirus?
It was, and who knows if this is going to happen, because I can't imagine that it would come through Congress right now, but the White House has put together they're proposing, or they're at least thinking through whether they want to have some kind of legislation, or if not, an executive order that would eliminate liability for consumers. So they couldn't sue where they're going into, like your grocery store or Walt Disney World, but also for their employees. So there would be the employer protection would not exist. But the way I'm looking at it is like anyone who works at Walt Disney World should now be getting the hazard pay that the employees get at the Tomorrowland Speedway, because it is it is a hazardous environment to be somewhere so populated.
Right. So that's, I'm kind of thinking that it may come to that, where there's some sort of legislation or executive order or something from the government that says, people who go out in public once things start to reopen reasonably should expect that they could come in contact with someone who has the virus, and if that's something that happens, you can't sue over that. That almost seems like it would be a necessity before you could, because otherwise, I mean, you could sue anywhere. You could sue the gas station, you could sue the grocery store, you could sue McDonald's, even though they're closed and you have to go through the drive-through. I mean, it's still possible to get coronavirus from the person working the drive-through. So, like, all of these things, like Rich said at the beginning, I mean, it's almost a no-brainer that people are going to catch coronavirus somehow when things reopen, just like it's a no-brainer that, you know, if enough people climb this rock wall, somebody's going to fall and die. It's sort of like an expectation, not something that you're going to have to sign a waiver for.
They call that in tort law assumption of risk. When you engage in certain behavior, you're assuming a risk of certain logical outcomes may happen, but, you know, which is why, like, you expect a reasonable person to anticipate certain outcomes. And so for somebody like my dad, who is nearly 70 and previous issues with his lungs, like, he's not going to be going to Disney until there is either a treatment that is, like, pretty much foolproof, or there is a vaccine and herd immunity. And I think the first people that will be going are people who are low risk, and they decide, like, okay, this is a risk that I'm comfortable assuming. So that said, there are certain things that I think, you're assuming a risk because you're going into this space, but you're also it's also fair to assume that Disney is taking certain precautions. And so there's a perverse, like, you don't want to create a perverse incentive where companies feel like they're going to be completely insulated from liability, and then they don't follow protocols that are natural.
Right, and that's the kind of negligence thing that I was talking about earlier.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I would think that it would be unconscionable to create it where you can't in any way have an avenue for some lawsuit, depending on the behavior or the lack of behavior that's engaged in the people who owe the duty of care. But you're right. People that are going to be going out in public until there's a cure and until there's a vaccine, there is going to be some assumption of risk. Those people that are still going to the grocery store right now, you're assuming some risk. But you also expect that the grocery store has put in protocols like the employees, if they're feeling sick, need to be able to stay home, so they're not in the store coughing all over the place. You know, if Disney doesn't provide that kind of sick time to their employees, and their employees are not, one of the things I thought about was, if the cast members want to wear a mask, but they're forbidden from wearing masks because of Disney's strict guidelines, like, I would think that is a problem. That is creating a more hazardous condition for the cast members and for the guests. And so, I think that there needs to be some kind of balance and some kind of logic here, and where we're going to draw the line and how, I don't know, because we don't have a modern day precedent for anything like this.
Yep. And I was talking with my wife and kids, because we are obviously supposed to go on the WDW&T cruise in August, but we were actually going to go on a cruise earlier than that as well. And so, talking about risk and assumption of risk, I think certainly a cruise vacation has got to be pretty high on the risky types of vacation that you could think of. I mean, I think it would probably, at least in my mind, my calculation of risk is that it's probably safer to go to Walt Disney World, where you're outside most of the time, than to go on a cruise for a week and be trapped on a boat with 2,600 people who, even if one or two of them have coronavirus, you still might catch it. So, I think this...
Yeah, cruises were public health nightmares before.
Yeah, they were, right? Like, you would think that, with all the norovirus outbreaks, that, the cruises would have been funneling hundreds of millions of dollars into virus, research to combat norovirus, let alone something like coronavirus. But, so I think, people are going to be flocking to Walt Disney World before anybody's cruising again, for the most part, but we'll have to see.
Right.
how all this works itself out too. Any other thoughts on?
Well, the only other thing
You mentioned something.
I mean,
Sorry, Jill, you go.
Oh, I was just going to say the other thing to keep in mind, along the lines of what Rich had said earlier, that this is all tentative and unconfirmed and what have you. The other thing to keep in mind about this plan or anything Disney or any other business tries to do is that this is going to be a constantly fluid and evolving and iterating process as we see what happens when businesses reopen. In some ways, I'm kind of grateful to the state of Georgia for being a guinea pig for the rest of us to kind of be able to see what happens, because we all want to know. We all want to know, like, is it going to be safe? Are we going to be okay to be able to go back out and start, in a phased approach, start, kind of like reclaiming our lives again? And I think Disney's going to be the same way. That they've got. I think part of this whole plan that they have is them absolutely needing to do some show that they're doing due diligence in planning for, and I think it's a very conservative plan, because I think that's where they need to be right now, both in terms of, keeping their expectations in check and also complying with what everyone is expecting of them in terms of providing a safe environment when they do reopen. But who knows what will happen? We could find out after, Georgia starts reopening things for a couple of weeks that cases soar again. And suddenly, I don't even think this secure circuit protocol will matter at that point if they can't even open a couple of businesses and all of a sudden coronavirus cases skyrocket. So, we can look at this as what Disney is thinking right now, but I guarantee you, and even, this is a few days old, there's probably already, if this is legit, then there's probably already been changes to this based on, I'm quite sure Disney's got a committee of people that are monitoring every single thing that's happening with this situation 24/7 and adjusting their plans. And that's going to continue to happen, where they're going to try to give guests confidence that they can be safe to come when things can reopen, but also doing what they can to maximize what they can accommodate in terms of both people and what's open, and how basically, how much profit can they generate based on how many guests they can allow into the parks and how many people can eat in restaurants and all of that. So it's, we can talk about where this stands right now, but chances are it's going to change several times even before the parks even start thinking about reopening, much less once they do.
Yeah, and it's like the closure. Sorry.
Go ahead, Rich.
Like the closure, it'll probably happen. Hopefully less uncoordinated, but we'll see how that goes. But with Disney spanning Osceola and Orange County and being in the state of Florida, that's 3 governments that have to work together with Disney to get Disney open. And given the way Governor DeSantis...
As long as they keep All Stars closed, they don't have to worry about Osceola County.
Yeah, that's true. Well, what about Animal Kingdom, though? Isn't that an Osceola County?
I don't know if Animal Kingdom actually is.
I'd have to look at them. Yeah,
I know the All Stars are. Again.
Yeah, definitely. But even so, it's a complicated thing. And as much as the governor delayed and finally Orange and Osceola County said, enough, we're closing. I don't, who knows what the reverse is going to be. Will they also be able to say, locally, we just are not comfortable opening yet, despite what the governor says, and so we're going to delay, and that'll cause Disney to delay.
I think you're seeing that in Georgia for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, not local governments necessarily, but individual businesses.
Yeah.
I think you are seeing local governments too. Yeah. I mean, and I think for what it's worth, I don't think we're going to see a reopening that has any better coordination in terms of, local and state and federal governments getting on the same page. I don't think reopening is going to be any more coordinated than closing was.
I would unfortunately agree.
So I have a response to Jill to what you were saying about what happens when you relax restrictions, but I want to hear what Allison was going to ask first, because this could kind of get off topic.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably tangential, but when you were talking in the beginning about all the different protocol that might be put in place, and the idea of having them we saw that in Shanghai, the markers on the ground with, okay, this is a 6-foot distance. And I'm envisioning what a queue would be like when you have your family of 4 or 5, and then somebody else has their family of 4 or 5, 6 feet away. Suddenly these markers are like completely useless. It's just like, is then everyone just going to guess what this space is? Like a high school marching band line that's supposed to be 10 yards apart, and they never are. It's like, like that's,
well, the other thing that I thought was
envision.
funny, the thing that I thought was funny about some of the pictures from Shanghai with their distancing measures on the ground is like, so if you go into like a grocery store, they'll have boxes on the ground where you're supposed to stand that are 6 feet apart from the next box. But it looked to me like the Shanghai marks on the ground were where you weren't supposed to stand. So you were actually allowed to stand on the sidewalk, but not in the box. And that was confusing to me to begin with when I first looked at it, until I realized what was supposed to be happening there. But yeah, that's totally confusing. But so
now available at the Emporium and MK, 2-meter sticks for distancing with all your favorite characters.
That's right. Your stick cannot touch another person's stick. That's right. I read an article yesterday about what's going on in Japan, specifically the island of Hokkaido, where Hokkaido was among the first areas in Japan to take some pretty strict measures to shut things down, and they really didn't have much of an outbreak of coronavirus at all. But because of that, they were also one of the first places in Japan to start relaxing their social distancing and closure requirements. And they did, I think they ended a lot of closures right before a 3-day weekend. And so what happened was everybody was ready to, dying to get out of their house. And then there's a 3-day weekend. So everybody goes out and eats out and things. And then there was a huge spike in coronavirus cases. And then they had to shut everything down again. So that's clearly, to me, what's going to happen. Just because Ron DeSantis says, oh, Florida's past the peak of coronavirus, doesn't mean that the peak isn't going to happen again once they let everyone out, a free-for-all kind of thing. So the question in my mind is not, are we past the peak, but how many people actually still are contagious? And if we let all those people out, what's going to happen? Because there's going to be a huge rampant spread of coronavirus again. Yeah.
And it's one thing for him to say we're past this peak, and another thing to just say we're past the peak. The next peak could be much higher, especially for a place like Central Florida, which is not unfortunately where I live, a hot spot. And they have never had the testing that they need in Florida. Like Louisiana, we're usually the worst in everything. We're one of the best in testing. So that's kind of nice because we have some confidence that the new cases that are reported each day is somewhat accurate because of the wide availability of the testing. I do like their
and up to date too.
Central. Right. I mean, I know at 12:20 I get the text all the time from our emergency system, so I know what happened from the day before, and I've seen a downward trend over the last 2.5 weeks, which is really exciting because it was getting really bad here. But I'm looking at Central Florida, and I'm like, all right, in the absence of testing, it is kind of nice to look at. These are the number of people on ventilators. That's a really important marker. But because there are so many people who are asymptomatic that go around without widespread testing, I'm like, you really don't know that much about it. What you can tell from that is like the percentage of the vulnerable population that have gotten very sick. And that's just not enough information for us to be making public health.
There's no data to be able to translate that sort of surrogate marker to the population as a whole. And that's the problem. Like, if you knew that for every one person on a ventilator, there's 300 people who have had some, symptoms or even asymptomatic, but have contracted the virus, then you could sort of use that as a surrogate marker. But that data doesn't even exist, so there's no way possible to do that.
And also the fact that we still have no idea that once you've had it or you have the antibodies for it, we still have no idea whether you're you're safe, whether you can get it again. So
you could get it again. Yep.
Yeah.
So that's not even a marker we can use to say, well, I've already had it or I've tested positive for antibodies, so I feel like I can assume a reasonable amount of risk in going back out into society. We have no idea.
Right.
Yeah.
And when you think about Florida
I guess...
and about temperature testing, I'll just continue. I mean, Florida's hot. I run warm anyway. I run even warmer when I'm in July and August in Florida.
Yeah, right.
And
Everybody's
when I get an allergy,
over 100.
When my allergies act up, my temperature climbs. I'm not. I don't have the virus. On the other hand, I may be down there in September and it's cool and I'm cool and I'm asymptomatic and I have the virus. So to me, one of the tests that I think is a placebo is the temperature test. It doesn't seem in the Venn diagram of the population that has it and doesn't. It's really indeterminate. It seems like, hey, we got to do something, and that's not really it.
It's just like the bag checks.
I was just going to say, the
don't
test
get us
is going to be
started.
as effective as the bag check. Yep, which means not effective at all. Yes, exactly what I was going to say. So I think, certainly, so the only thing that I can say that, an antibody test could tell you for sure is if you have antibodies, you must have been exposed at some point. Whether you had the virus and were asymptomatic, or whether, that sniffle the other day was actually as much as you got from the virus, you were at least exposed. So if you have tested positive for an antibody test, but you don't remember being sick, that's actually a good thing. Like, that would be the case where those are the people that you want to allow into Walt Disney World, because they have the antibodies. They already had the virus. They're not going to get sick, and so they're probably not going to be contagious. Those are the kind of people that you want to be able to interact with, not people that have never had any exposure at all to the virus. Those you just have no idea. But in any case, I think Ron DeSantis says, "Oh well, we're past the peak." That sounds really optimistic, but Allison, like you said, well, there's a downward trend. That's more accurate, but less optimistic sounding, just simply because a downward trend can turn right around and go back up again in no time with very limited, reason. So, I mean, somebody who
one wrestling competition and it's over.
Exactly. That's right. One person could go out to some restaurant and sneeze, and boom, it's trending back upwards again. So, and I think that's the problem that a lot of these, a lot of the politicians that are talking about reopening things sort of fail to realize, is that the only reason things are trending downward right now is because no one's out and about.
Yeah, I think it might have been in South Korea, maybe. They had like a super carrier. They identified one individual who infected like 1,200 people before she was identified and quarantined. So, it's entirely possible that one person, especially, and it's because she went to a lot of religious church type events. So she was out there spreading it to like all these different people in large gatherings. And I mean, that's a Walt Disney World situation. You have one person who's like super contagious and brings in the virus, and suddenly, you could infect thousands of people in Walt Disney World in a matter of, an afternoon.
Yeah. I think there was an epidemiologist in Seattle, which people in the epidemiology industry are looking for as kind of the model, because they got out ahead of it really, really fast. And he said, I forget the exact words, he was much more eloquent, but basically, if everybody complains that we didn't need to do anything, then we probably did what we had to do, because that's really the outcome that you want. People don't even, nothing happens, and therefore, why did you do all this? Well, if we didn't do all of that, something would have happened.
Right.
So,
well, it's impossible to know whether we overreact or not.
Right, it's impossible.
I think it's clear that we didn't overreact because it's,
I think we have several
coronavirus
test
is far worse
cases.
in the United States. It's far worse here in the U.S. than it is in any other country in the world, in part because we moved slowly, and you see that being reflected now. No, if anything, we underreacted. So.
Yeah, there was a friend of mine who's now no longer with us, but he hiked the Appalachian Trail up and down well into his 70s. And one of his sayings was, there's never only one peak. You always go up and down and up and down, up and down. I'm thinking of that in this situation. There's never going to be just one peak. Everything is kind of a combination up and down, up and down.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't think the solve for that happens until there's either a vaccine or a treatment.
Agree.
And that's another factor. Talking about how all of this will evolve significantly over time. Should a treatment be discovered, suddenly lots of things change about how risky it is. Things like waivers to come into Walt Disney World aren't necessarily an issue anymore because you can easily get treated for it. So, let's hope.
Yep. It'll be like smallpox.
Yeah, I mean, I think
hopefully,
Yeah,
nobody really thinks about it anymore.
Treatments are going to come about much sooner than a vaccine is going to come about.
Yeah.
The question is, are the treatments effective enough that you really don't have to worry about contracting coronavirus anymore?
Yeah.
Well, or if you contract it, it keeps you off the ventilator and it keeps you off of death's bed, basically. If
it
the
keeps you out of the hospital.
Can be shown,
really
if the treatment can be shown to that, then that's an effective treatment. I mean, vaccines. If J&J actually Johnson & Johnson actually introduces their clinical trials for their vaccine in January, it will have been the fastest vaccine development ever by 4x or something like that, if I remember right. So it's that's a low probability event, unfortunately.
Yeah. No, we're talking a long time out for a vaccine.
I think vaccine is wishful thinking for the most part. Yeah.
Sadly, that's just not the way the physics works, unfortunately.
Yeah. All right. So, I think there's a couple other things that I want to talk about in terms of reopening and what's happening. Obviously, things like character meet and greets and character meals are likely to not gonna be happening when Walt Disney World first reopens. I already said it's likely that water parks aren't going to reopen. What do we think in terms of virtual queues? Because this was talked about a bit earlier. Several weeks ago we talked about virtual queues. But my thought in terms of virtual queues is, if you have to walk through the same queue, then any surface in that queue is going to be, a potential transmission vector for the virus, whether or not there's 100 people in the queue or just you walking through it, right? Like, if everyone who rides the attraction has to walk through the same queue, sure, they're not standing next to each other in the queue, which helps, but they're still going through the same area. If a guest goes through every 20 seconds, there's, and coronavirus is on some surface in that queue where it can live for hours and hours and days. I don't know that a virtual queue is going to actually help anything. And additionally, if there's a virtual queues, which means you're not in a queue in a show building or whatever, that's just going to be how many thousands more people either in shops where they're not going to fit because they have to remain distant socially, social distancing in place in the shops, or just out in the walkways walking around where it's going to be difficult to do social distancing. So my thought is the whole, a lot of people talked about how virtual queues are going to be the new norm and how it's going to solve all the problems. I don't think a virtual queue is the solution to anything, to be honest.
No. Yeah, your second point was kind of has been my issue with virtual queues all along, which is if people aren't in a queue, where are they? And if you still have even 5,000 people in the Magic Kingdom, there's nowhere for people to go to be occupied. They can't just be standing around. They need to be occupied with something. There's not enough. There's not enough room for them.
It's the same exact problem that FastPass caused when it was first introduced. FastPass was a great idea to get people out of queues and into stores. But the more attractions that have FastPass, the more people jam up the stores and the walkways and everything else because they're not in a queue. So a virtual queue does nothing, I don't think, to solve any problems related to crowds or coronavirus.
Yeah.
And if the parks are already at reduced capacity because of social distancing requirements, then taking people out of a queue and putting them into a shop is solving nothing.
Yeah, no, they need somewhere to go, and there's not enough room in the Magic Kingdom to accommodate those people and keep them busy, especially not when there's no parades and there's no castle shows and there's no other entertainment within the park. There's definitely nothing for them to do. So if you're going to not have them in a queue, where are they going to go?
So we bring back the Tomorrowland cabanas, and everybody gets assigned a Tomorrowland cabana to wait while they separately while their queue time comes up, and that they're just throughout Walt Disney World. There's 5,000 cabanas throughout Walt Disney World.
So you're either in a cabana or you're in one of the little squares in the queue as you walk through the Pirates queue or whatnot.
Right.
One thing that I just thought of too is the idea of no castle stage shows or fireworks. To be honest, as long as you're 6 feet away from the next person, standing in front of the castle for an hour or standing waiting for fireworks for an hour seems to be a pretty ideal situation because you're far enough away from everyone else. There's no handrails or anything that you're going to be touching repeatedly, and it's outdoors. So to me, that's the ideal solution to a lot of the problems of capacity is, you should put boxes on the ground where people are allowed to stand and let them stand for a stage show and let them stand for a parade and fireworks. That's perfect. That is better than forcing people to wait in a queue line, or touching ride vehicles and handrails and whatnot. It's going to be much better. So I would almost say opening the Magic Kingdom with only stage shows and fireworks might actually be a much better way to go than opening it with only rides.
Yeah, but you have 6 feet of distance from someone and then they start coughing. And suddenly 6 feet of distance is not enough from somebody who starts coughing right next to you in their little box. So it would
have to be more than 6 feet because you'd want to allow 6 feet of room for people to move in and out of their 6 foot box. So you'd probably have a grid of 6 foot boxes that people could stand in the middle of other 6 foot boxes that people could move through, because you don't want to. You can't stay in your 6 foot box, and when you move, you still have to be 6 feet away from people. So you have to be in a different. It's like
you can't leave your box.
Giant game of checkers where every box, if you're a king, you can go anywhere, but until you get kinged, you can't move at all. I don't know how they would do that, but they could do that. But again, capacity would be really, really small. And to your point, Jason, earlier, you'd need a ton of cast members to coordinate and enforce and help people do that, I would think. So I don't know about your cash flow.
I think so. The other thing,
and then
can we also talk
more
about
social distancing from all those extra cast members, because now you need to be 6 feet away from them too. So they're just, if you're talking about square footage of the Magic Kingdom, every cast member takes up 36 square feet, 6 foot in each direction. So maybe that's how you factor it, is how many square feet is the Magic Kingdom, and then multiply that times every 6 by 6 foot square.
Well, you put all the cast members in bunny suits so they don't enter the equation at all. The high tech bunny, the high tech hazmat suits, not an actual bunny suit. But
Yeah.
Right. Because otherwise people will want pictures with them if they're in an actual bunny suit.
Exactly. Yeah. That
Although,
would be good.
if they're in a hazmat suit, people will probably think they're from Monsters Inc. and want pictures with them too.
It'll be the new photo op, the new meet and greet.
That's right.
Meet and greet.
That's right.
Maybe with a hazmat helmet.
Can we also talk about the absurdity of the 6-foot rule and how it's not really based on any science? And all these places are putting boxes on the ground that are 6 feet apart. And like tomorrow, some scientist could come out and say, well, actually, a 7.5-foot rule is so much better than a 6-foot rule. And now there's all these boxes that are 6 feet away and they have to go change them all. Like that's going to completely change the calculation. That's a change to the 6-foot rule is going to completely change the calculation of how many people could be safely accommodated in the Magic Kingdom.
Yeah, I mean to an extent, scientists.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to an extent, scientists there's a lot of debate about this already. Like, I don't know how we settled on 6 foot, other than I think 6 foot is easier for people to wrap their heads around, and also less kind of bizarre in functioning out in the world. Like if you go to the grocery store, it's kind of easy to figure out if you're 6 feet away from somebody. But if you suddenly need to be 15 feet away from somebody, that's suddenly a whole different amount of space. And also the businesses are then able to accommodate less people. And I don't think anybody wants that. People are already waiting in line to get into a grocery store. If you up the distance to 8 feet or whatever, suddenly that becomes even worse. And I don't think anybody wants to see that. But I really do think the 6 foot thing is relatively arbitrary and just kind of people seized on it because it feels good. It feels like it makes sense, even if it's not
like a temperature
data driven at all. Mm-hmm.
Or a bag check. I mean, the other thing too is that you think about a grocery store, the aisles aren't really 6 feet wide. You technically can't pass someone in a grocery store aisle. It's almost like they need to have one-way aisles in the grocery store. Because
they do.
Do they? I haven't seen that.
Giant here absolutely does. And at least 25% of people disobey that rule because suddenly it's so ridiculously inconvenient. Theoretically you're supposed to start on one side of the store. They're only grocery stores normally have 2 entrances, one on either side. Most stores I've been to which is only 3 in the last month, you're forced to go in one side. If you try to go in the other side, they tell you, no, this is the exit. You have to go in the other side. You go in one side, you're supposed to go up and down the aisles and then go through the cash register lane and check out and leave. Well, if you get to frozen foods and you realize you forgot something in produce, you're technically, according to what they want you to do, you're SOL. You need to check out, leave the store, and then re-enter to get the things you forgot, which nobody's going to actually do that. But I mean, technically that's what they're trying to do. But people are at least 20 to 25% of people are going the wrong way up the aisles right now.
What if you're behind someone who insists on reading all the ingredients before they buy an item?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You can't
they're standing there looking
you're not 6 feet away.
They're standing there looking at the 37 different varieties of Progresso soup and, taking their time picking out what they want. And technically, yes, there's not 6 foot around them for you to pass them, but it's happening constantly.
Yeah.
Right.
And enforcement varies too. In our big grocery store, there are arrows taped on the floor and you're supposed to follow them. But like you said, a lot of people don't. And in the produce and deli area, there really aren't arrows because how do you do that? Well, we went to a little market that's near us that is a little, it's a little high end, a little upscale. And they have barriers and ropes and guides and hostesses and everything to guide you specifically up and down the aisles the right way. And boy, everybody was marching in lockstep. But it actually made for a little bit of a less stress experience because everybody was doing the same thing, and
was doing what they're supposed to do. Well, and if you have enough people to ensure that that happens, then yeah, it makes a lot of sense. The question, I think, is just like Jill's experience in her grocery store. I don't think Walt Disney World is going to have enough cast members to make sure that people do things that way.
Right. If
I think Disney
goes
World
back to the. Go ahead.
I was just going to say Disney World is kind of like the epitome of people not following the rules at least some of the time. And this is why we can't have enough things.
Yeah. They don't have enough cast members to make people do things that they're supposed to do on a regular day, let alone when there's, pandemics.
Yep. Sir, there's no smoking here. But I'm smoking. Yes, but there's no smoking here. But I'm smoking here. So therefore there is smoking here. No, sir, there is. Oh, boy. Yeah. Yeah. So that goes back to the cash flow question. If they actually have enough cast members to enforce COVID-style restrictions, would they even open? Because now they're negative flow in a big time. So would that even be worthwhile?
Yeah, that's my big concern, is that trying to reopen under these really strict protocols is going to wind up actually losing them more money.
Yeah. Yep. And just like, I think it's the same for the cruise lines too. Like, a cruise ship doesn't really make money if it's less than 90% full. And even if they, almost give the rooms away, they still make money from casinos and excursions and everything else. So how the cruise industry is going to function with social distancing in place is it's just not going to work. They're not going to make money.
Yeah, to your point earlier about the hotel rooms, if everybody stays in their cabin, you're fine. But nobody would stay in their cabin. So you only move into a common cabin essentially with everybody else. So it's even worse. Yeah, it's tough.
Yep. I want to talk a little bit about how bad Shop Disney is, because this is a pet peeve of mine this week. And I don't know how many of you have experienced it, but there was some merchandise. It was the Joe Rohde ears on Saturday.
Yep.
Released, and they were supposed to be released at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, and at 10:00 and 20 seconds Eastern Time, they were already sold out. So here's my issue. All right. So first of all, this company's making no money except from Shop Disney. It's their only source of income. They insist on selling things that aren't limited edition. They're limited release, which means they can make as many of them as they want, yet they still sell out in 20 seconds. The CEO of this company is a marketing person who was previously in charge of consumer products at this company. Before that, they were in charge of marketing at another consumer products company. How hard is it to figure out how to sell product fairly and get enough product so that everyone who wants to buy your product can give you money? If it's the only way that you can make money, why are you doing this? How dumb are you? That's all. That's my rant. Well, if you guys want to comment, please do.
So yes, I tried to buy the Rohde ears at like 10:02 or like literally 2 minutes after they went on sale, and no, nothing. And the problem is not just that they're sold out. The problem is that people are experiencing massive problems. I mean, we have people on staff who have been charged multiple times. Like they got charged like $100 for a $12 pin set or whatever. It's this gross misfunctioning of the system. And so I think we've speculated and had a few talks internally that part of the problem here is people are identifying that because this merchandise is in demand, because it's the only access people have to Disney Parks merchandise right now. You have people that are trying to use technological means to swoop in and snatch up every single item they possibly can, and then resell it on eBay for 3 or 4 times what they paid for it, which is absolutely happening with this merchandise. So that's bad enough. But if on top of that, the handful of legitimate customers who can get in and purchase the merchandise are, some people are having their orders canceled after the fact. Some people are being charged multiple times. It's really ridiculous. And yes, for the fact that this is really the only way Disney has to bring in revenue right now, the fact that it's failing so miserably, and it's failed repeatedly. You know, it happened with the Cinderella Castle merchandise. It happened with the mini main event, and it's interesting. So, the March mini main event was Mad Tea Party, and I was able to get on at 10:05, 10:10, and put some things in my cart. I wound up not buying them, but I would have been able to buy them. They were there. And then by the time April got here, a month later, all of a sudden, like all hell broke loose and everything fell apart and all these problems started happening. So it's like, it's almost as if the system has gotten worse. You know, I don't recall people having this level of issues with Shop Disney before. So where did these problems suddenly come from? And why aren't they redirecting their technical people to fix these problems and prevent, online resellers from getting in there and snatching everything up? There are ways to do that. Other companies have figured out ways to do that, and yet Disney is so behind on this again, which is kind of a hallmark for them at this point, is really dropping the ball on technology.
They dropped the ball in technology, and they dropped the ball in merchandise. And Shop Disney, they're dropping the ball twice. The ball is hitting both of their feet at the same time. I just think
they dropped
it's
it, then they went to pick it up, and then they kicked it out of their hands as they went to pick it up. Kind of thing. Yeah, we don't buy a whole lot on Shop Disney, and I successfully got the Earth Day pin for my daughter, so that was good, and we actually ended up not being charged multiple times. But previously, we tried to get the puzzle for the Cinderella Castle collection, and first it showed up on the product page as being out of stock, and you couldn't click on it. When we went back, it was shown as being in stock. You could add to cart, but then a little notice pops up: maximum number of this product is 0 per person. And then another time you get to add it to your park, and then when you go to check out, it says, "Oh, this is out of stock." So it's not, in my opinion, not just that the technology is incompetent, and it might be probably just that the left hand doesn't even know how many fingers it has, never mind talking to the right hand. But the whole experience is poorly conceived, poorly designed from what you want to be able to offer your customers. I mean, if a thing is out of stock, say that it's out of stock. Don't offer it to add to cart and
don't
then
let
say
them
that
put it in their cart.
Available. Right. I mean, that's merchandising e-commerce 101 from the 2000s. I mean, what? How can that possibly be from a multi-billion-dollar company, from a division that is headed by a guy who now heads the whole company, who cut his teeth on merchandising? It boggles the mind. It truly does.
I don't think they sell a lot of ketchup online.
Yeah, that's true. Commodity versus collectibles is a different thing, but still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, totally agree.
You still should know a little bit about it.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Allison never buys anything, so she doesn't really have any
That's
comments.
exactly right. I have zero experience with Shop Disney.
I remember
my dad has bought some clothes for the baby, though, from Shop Disney, so there's some pretty adorable outfits that we have, and he buys pretty much
Luckily,
everything
they're not limited release.
Available. Exactly. So we have no experience with like double charging or not being able to get anything, but I don't even go on the website. That's why I've got, gray walls here. It's a whole bunch of nothing in my home. Minimalist.
What's really interesting is that when the Living Seas and the Journey of Water posters came out a couple weeks ago, those were limited edition of 100, and those were around for like 10 or 15 minutes because I bought two. I bought the 2 out of the 4 that I liked, and then I thought, well, I should probably just get the whole set. So then I went back like 10 minutes later, and I got the 2 that I didn't like. But they were around for 15 minutes or more before they sold out, and there were only 100 of
Some
them.
of them.
So
The Living Seas sold out really fast, but The Seas with Nemo and Friends was around for a few hours. Like that was still around for a little while. Yeah.
I didn't like that one. Or the Turtle Talk. I didn't like that one either.
Yeah.
They were my second order. But anyway, yeah, I mean, in any case, I think that whole Shop Disney needs to be blown up and recreated or something, because it's a nightmare. But yeah, I mean, all this stuff would, if these things were parks releases, you know, people would be lining up at the parks, but there's a limited number of people that can actually go and line up at the parks for merchandise. But the fact that these are online and the whole world has access to it at the same exact moment in time, somebody needs to figure out some way to handle that, because clearly they're not handling it well. All right, last topic for tonight that we're going to talk about, and this is the topic that Jill suggested last week and was on the show last week to discuss, and we didn't have time to discuss it last week. So we're going to get it in this week in case Jill can't be on next week. The Disney's practice of opening lands without all of their attractions being open. And so we're going to compare and contrast something like Pandora opening with its two main attractions, both open on the same day. The whole land opened on the same day and everything was operational, versus Galaxy's Edge, where only one of the two attractions, and admittedly the not best attraction, opened with the land, and then there was a several-month delay until the second attraction opened. And now the announcement that Avengers Campus in Disney California Adventure is going to follow the same sequence, where the land is going to open without its full slate of attractions. This was something that Jill wanted to talk about because it really did impact her thoughts on Galaxy's Edge when she visited Galaxy's Edge before Rise of the Resistance was open. So I'm going to let Jill start with this, and then we can all chime in.
Well, and it's just, I find it interesting because I struggled to find an example of Disney having done this prior to Galaxy's Edge. You might argue that, New Fantasyland, when it reopened in stages, although I wouldn't consider that the same because it wasn't a new land, and because it was already existing within the Magic Kingdom, it was almost impossible for it to reopen all at once. And it didn't really make sense. And New Fantasyland was still part of Fantasyland. So while it's a new area, it was not, the rest of Fantasyland was still there. It's not like Fantasyland as a whole was gone. Anyway, but the point being, I struggled to find an example of this really before Galaxy's Edge. And so I went back and kind of looked at the last lands that opened before Galaxy's Edge and what the experience was there. And when you go back, especially looking at Pandora, that was such a huge thing for Disney. And it allowed them to ride this PR wave of how great Pandora was, how gorgeous it was, how amazing the rides were. I mean, such a huge part of the fanfare of Pandora opening and the PR, kind of boost that they got from that was around how amazing the e-ticket in Pandora is, which is Flight of Passage, versus you flip over to Galaxy's Edge. And I mean, the news kind of carried so many stories about Galaxy's Edge being kind of wah-wah. It was, everybody had been anticipating this for such a long time. And then when it got here, it really fell flat. And I think it fell flat in major part because there was only one attraction and it wasn't the e-ticket attraction. Whereas fast forward to Rise of the Resistance opening, and it was like, the problem with Rise opening later was it wasn't any more attached to the opening of the land. It was just a new attraction opening. So I don't know that the rest of Galaxy's Edge got, and I'm not saying that there weren't more people in Galaxy's Edge, there absolutely were, but it didn't get the boost to the reputation of the land because of it. And I think overall as a land, people still kind of feel pretty lukewarm about Galaxy's Edge, even though they might think Rise of the Resistance is amazing. And for my part, I do, absolutely, 100%. Jason will verify this because he was there with me the first time I wrote it, that I was just like, I was in awe and said repeatedly, like, Rise of the Resistance is the best thing I've ever seen. It's amazing. But it is now a separate experience for me from experiencing Galaxy's Edge as a land for the first time. And now looking at Avengers Campus in Disneyland opening, and their e-ticket isn't going to open for years. I mean, it's not slated for, I think, 2 years after, well, and now, you know, the original opening date was in July, and I think it's pretty clear that's not going to happen. But to say you're not going to open, you're going to open a kind of a mid-level ride now with the land and some restaurants and some shops and whatever, but you're not going to open the e-ticket. So in part, to me, this is not just about opening the land without all of its attractions. It's about opening the land without its e-ticket. Because, I mean, honestly, what's the point? That's kind of my question with all of this, is why do you open a land without the e-ticket when that's going to be the draw?
You know,
so I think
you're right that I think you're right that there's no precedent for this with lands opening without like the e-ticket, but there's sort of precedent with theme parks opening. Because when I think about the opening of MGM Studios and the opening of Animal Kingdom, these are parks that were opened like as shells of really what they should be. I don't know if this is controversial, but when you look at opening day attractions at MGM, and I'm going to use the old name, not Hollywood Studios, because that's what it's called. But you've got Great Movie Ride, you've got Backlot Tour, and that was it for rides. I think I don't think I'm missing anything from opening, right? And then Animal Kingdom, right after that.
But yeah, rides,
right? But it wasn't a ride, and Star Tours opened soon after that, but that at least is a ride. But like opening day, you've got two things open. And then Animal Kingdom, you had Countdown to Extinction, you had the train.
I would argue that Kilimanjaro Safaris is an e-ticket,
and
though.
Kilimanjaro, so absolutely an e-ticket, but it's a whole park, right? And so there's 3 rides in a whole park and like 2 rides in a whole park. And the thing is, I think this had like long-term impacts economically for these parks because they weren't open with more robust lands. Because like as somebody who remembers really clearly what Animal Kingdom was like, I like Animal Kingdom now, but it took me a really long time to get there. I didn't suddenly jump on board when Asia was opened. It kind of was a slow burn for me. I think because I had the memory of like going and being disappointed because I had expected a lot more investment before it was open to the public. And so I think what we're seeing with Galaxy's Edge and what we're seeing with what we'll see with Marvel Avengers Campus is that like there's some disappointment to it. It's a smaller scale of the experience, but it takes longer than for people to fully embrace the land.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that about Animal Kingdom. Oh, go ahead, Rich.
I was just going to say, so just to interject, what Tom might say, of course, would be because money. Agreed that the mind share and the excitement for any land or any park depends very much on the quality, number, and experience that you have when the park is open, which builds buzz, which builds excitement, which makes even more people want to come. And I think we saw in Galaxy's Edge, there was some of that, but it was diminished because everybody said, well, you know, Smuggler's Run is good, but, and there was always a but. And if you had Rise of the Resistance, there probably wouldn't have been that but. Can you imagine if they opened Pandora with only the river ride? It would have been disastrous because that's not a amazing ride. It's a nice ride, but they were going for much more than nice. A couple of people in chat have made this point, and I was going to make it too. Disneyland and Disney World both opened with a very diminished Tomorrowland because money. If I remember the history correctly, Disneyland opened Tomorrowland with Hall of Aluminum and the toilet exhibit because that's who they could get sponsors for and that's who they could get money from. And I don't remember what the opening day attractions were in Disney World, but again, Eastern Airlines was there and they could get money, and even though it wasn't really exciting when it opened, and it took a few iterations. Some would argue that it's still not really exciting. It's gone up and down, but I think so there's two pieces. There's the business piece, and especially now with the Bobs in charge, that's most likely the priority. Cash flow will be king. And there's the experience piece and the mind share piece that you lose when you don't have a completely immersive experience with everything open, everything running, everything exciting you to go to land XYZ or park XYZ.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point too. And coupled with what Allison was saying about how, and especially I think studios maybe is a little different just because that's not what they meant for studios to be. To an extent, I feel like they opened studios with what they wanted to open studios with because that's what they were trying to put out there is what your experience was supposed to be in that park. But Animal Kingdom for sure, I was very underwhelmed going to Animal Kingdom, and it was the opening of Asia that really turned me around on it. And in part that was because at the time I loved Everest. I still love Everest, but being able to experience Everest when it was brand new and still so smooth and sleek and the Yeti working, like that blew me away. And I was sold on that. And then Finding Nemo, the musical, is still to this day one of my favorite things in the parks. So adding two attractions that I immediately fell in love with really turned around how I felt about the entire park. And I think, but to that point, I think there's still a lot of feeling of, it's taken 20 years at least for people to really like come around to Animal Kingdom, maybe in part because of that.
There was no nighttime show.
Well, that too. But to your point, Rich, I think, they're being really short-sighted because they're saying, let's get open what we can and start raking in money by being able to drive people there as soon as possible. They're losing out on this long-term, how people feel about it and how much it creates a desire in them to want to return and bring back more business. And so I think they're hurting themselves in the long term by trying to milk as much as they can out of it in the short term, which, is kind of Disney's MO these days.
Yeah. You said Disney's being short-sighted. That's a shocker.
That is their MO. It's kind of funny. We've been watching Shop Talk. We've been watching Shop Talk on Disney Plus because we like making things and so on. And they always have an Imagineer on as a guest judge, and inevitably the Imagineer says, well, the holistic immersive experience is the most important thing in development of whatever challenge they're struggling to solve. And then you look at the parks and it's like, well, I don't think the challenge to be immersive is the most important things based on that product.
It is, but the management just doesn't listen to the Imagineers. That's the problem.
Right, yes. So the end result is not the immersive experience.
Right. The end result is when managers became in charge and not the Imagineers, then things went downhill. But it's actually interesting to hear Allison bring up the whole idea of Animal Kingdom and Studios not opening with a full slate. I mean, it's one thing to open a park with 5 lands out of 6. I think that's fine. And like Jill said, I think Studios opened as pretty much what it was intended to be. People called Studios a half-day park for the longest time, but I think it was intended to be that when it opened. People called Animal Kingdom a half-day park when it opened, but it wasn't intended to be a half-day park. And even after Asia opened and Dinoland, Animal Kingdom was still, in many people's minds, a half-day park because there was no nighttime entertainment. And even now, Animal Kingdom's a half-day park because I don't stay for the Garbage Rivers of Light show. But in any case, I think opening a park with, 70 or 80% of its land's operational, and then you open a new land several years later, to me that kind of makes sense because it reinvigorates the park. It gives people another reason to return in several years, and you don't lose the immersive experience of the rest of the park. Assuming each land is its own immersive experience, you don't lose the immersivity of the rest of the park because one land is not open. But in terms of Star Wars Land, you absolutely lose something when half of the attractions are not open when the land opens. I mean, honestly, there was little incentive to go to Star Wars Land before Rise of the Resistance opened, and the only people that went and stood in long lines and went through all the hassle were people that were either Disney nuts or Star Wars nuts. There were loads and loads of typical vacationers that said, I'm going to wait to go to Disney until Rise opens because I don't want to go to a half-completed land. And so the question is whether that affected the bottom line in the long run, because you had all these people that went before Rise opened and said, it's missing something. It's not great. Did that, sort of sour the outlook on the land as a whole, or did the opening of Rise eclipse that and now people love it? It's hard to judge whether there was a detrimental effect, but clearly in public opinion, if you ask somebody how was Star Wars Land and they had gone before Rise of the Resistance opened, their answer was not the same as, if you asked them how was Pandora when they went right after Pandora opened. It was definitely not the same. Because there was nothing amazing. There was nothing stunning about Star Wars Land. People even complained about not knowing the land they're in or any characters that made any sense to them because it was an invented land. But beyond that, I think public sentiment was somewhat negative about Galaxy's Edge when it first opened.
Absolutely. And that was very much reflected in the media.
Yes. And has that hurt Disney? Has it hurt Hollywood Studios in the long run? I think the answer is yes. I think there's people that would be super excited to go to Disney World for a new land opening, but they're not super excited to go for Star Wars Land because they heard such negative things when it first opened. That Disney completely lost out on all of the positive word of mouth from the first, 4 months of Star Wars Land's opening? There was no positive word of mouth at all.
Well, and two other things I want to mention. One is that's also coming on the heels of Toy Story Land opening the year prior to really underwhelming fanfare. I think lots of people were pretty underwhelmed with Toy Story Land, and so you've got that already diminished expectation and outlook on what a new land at Hollywood Studios looks like, and then couple that with a lackluster experience in Galaxy's Edge. Here's one of the things that drove me the most crazy about Galaxy's Edge is they were kind of, it was sort of this one-way traffic flow, talking about, going to your grocery store with one-way traffic flow, where you were filtering in through Grand Avenue. And so you walk through that tunnel and your first experience in Galaxy's Edge is coming up out of that tunnel. There's nothing there. With Rise of the Resistance not open, there is nothing there. You come out of this tunnel and you expect to be like immersed in this land, and you're just like, there's some rocks and some trees and what's going on here? And it's not till you get pretty far into the land and come around the corner and you see the Millennium Falcon. Like, even the way they organized it to give you that experience of like being, when you walk into Pandora, you see all the crazy foliage, you see the floating mountains, you see all of it. But in Galaxy's Edge, you don't really know you're in a Star Wars land until you get pretty far in. And especially the way they have it set up with Rise being right there and being the first thing you see, with that not being open.
The first thing you see is a closed attraction.
Yeah, exactly. I think that in and of itself has a pretty significant psychological impact on somebody walking in there for the first time, really hoping, you know, and you talk about the people that went were huge Disney fans or huge Star Wars fans. As both, you know, I was pretty disappointed that I was like, okay, I walk in here, I want to be wowed the minute I come up out of that tunnel, and I'm just not.
And I think that also is partly one of the things that Disney is supposed to do is manipulate your perception so that you you know, have that feeling of comfort, that feeling of entertainment, that good feeling inside, for lack of a better word. And they missed that with Galaxy's Edge, because people's perception was, just like you said, it's a barren land because this big huge thing that we've all heard about is missing. And ditto for, although I'm not as familiar with Avengers in Disneyland, I know that there's supposed to be the amazing e-ticket Marvel ride, which is now going to be several years off. So what if they were more skilled, let's say, at manipulating perception and didn't announce those e-ticket rides? Do we think that ours and other people's impressions of the lands would be any different if they kind of kept it secret and said, this will be a continual process, but we're going to open it with this one ride and a few shops, and then as time goes on, you'll have exciting things happen?
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in Galaxy's Edge, was Galaxy's Edge opening without Rise? Like, that was not always part of the plan.
No, that's true. In that case, I believe you're correct. Yeah, that was a
plan
B.
Yeah. But I mean, the other piece of it is, then what are you saying? Like, what's the alternative? Is it to open a land, giving people the expectation that it's only going to have one non-e-ticket attraction? Like, I think
then people are going to bash it too. That's not good either.
I don't know that it's going to work, but it's not going to be better.
Right. I mean, that is what happened.
Toy Story Land was like, hey, yeah. We're going to open this whole land with 3 attractions, all of which are no good.
Right. And also there's, I mean, in Star Wars Land in particular, because the whole Star Wars universe is yin and yang, black and white, good and evil, you only opened with half of the, let's call it, for lack of a better word, spiritual, attention to just the smuggler's end sort of thing. There was no Empire except for the walk-around characters. There was no ride where you were threatened by the Empire and so forth. You were just having a good time with the rebels and doing some smuggling. So it is possible that the balance that engineers keep talking about was missing, and that may have filtered into the disappointment of the land too. I know that's kind of high design concept and all that, but
I think that's reasonable to say that. I think what the bigger problem in terms of the high design was that no one recognized anything in this land. Everyone was excited to go. So, like, imagine if
the design
Universal
was so high
opened,
you couldn't see it.
Yeah, like imagine if Universal opened Harry Potter Land with nothing that anyone recognized from any of the movies. That's pretty much what Disney did. Except for the Millennium Falcon, nothing in that land was recognizable from any of the movies. So they could have completely opened that land and called it something completely other than Star Wars Land, because Star Wars was not an integral part of the land. That's, I think, a different problem maybe than what you're saying, Rich, but I think it's a bigger problem.
It's definitely related.
Not something I want to get into tonight.
And they might have been able to overcome some of the negativity if people were like, oh, yay, we get to see Darth Vader and Chewie, instead of, Rey and random characters that they may not really recognize.
Yeah, I think... but I do think that, I think certainly the negativity surrounding the opening of Galaxy's Edge did not do any good for the company. Maybe their bottom line was a little bigger because they opened it 4 months earlier than they should have. But in the court of public perception, I don't think it was a winning move at all. I think it was a huge mistake. Now, whether Avengers Campus is going to be different, maybe part of what makes me say maybe is because they're reopening a part of the park that already pre-existed and they just closed. In any case, the walkway between Guardians of the Galaxy and Cars Land is sorely needed in that park. So regardless of anything, like honestly, I'd be happy for them to open just that little section of Avengers Campus and nothing else, because it would totally improve traffic flow. But I think maybe what could possibly give Avengers Campus a pass on the phased opening thing is the fact that there used to be things there and they took them away. So it's not, in my mind, the same as a totally new land that they created from scratch. It's kind of more like a really significant refurbishment where, you know, they took out all the attractions and all the theming. Yeah, kind of like that, where you know, it's, and especially with Guardians next to it, it's almost like an extension.
Yeah.
So, but I don't know.
Again, that's like a Toy Story kind of situation where you're basically taking one attraction that's been existing for quite some time and then
sort of building a land around it. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And you know, I also think that part of the problem with Toy Story Land was that the attractions are lackluster. You know, I think that was the problem with Star Wars Land. I think that's going to be the problem with Avengers. I think, but I think.
I mean, to me, the biggest problem.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say the biggest problem with Toy Story Land is the lack of anything else to do. I mean, you can go on the rides. You can, which yes, lackluster. I mean, I like Slinky Dog a lot, but it's nothing amazing, and I have no good things to say about alien swirling saucers. And it's almost like part of the problem is Toy Story Mania doesn't count. Like, I almost don't consider Toy Story Mania within the umbrella of Toy Story Land because it existed, and I feel like that's
was there before.
You know, nobody really is going to think about Mission Breakout as part of Avengers Campus because it's been around for so long. But the problem with Toy Story Land is there's nothing else to do. You know, you could, sure, if you're hungry, you go to Woody's Lunchbox, whatever, you're going to have probably a subpar experience there because there's never anywhere to sit. But there's no shops anywhere. I mean, we'll see once the new Woody's Barbecue place opens. But even that, you know, that's going to be a sit-down place. So no, there still won't be a store. And the fact that there's no Al's Toy Barn in Toy Story Land is just such like the most horrible decision ever. And like, I'm not going to be the first person to be like, Disney, find more ways to sell people crappy merchandise. Like, they built that little like closet in the exit of Toy Story Mania, which is the weirdest gift shop I've ever seen in a park. It's bad. It just makes it feel like you're like going into the, like, oh, this stuff fell off the truck kind of. Yeah, it's, the whole experience is really subpar there. But there's nothing else to do there. I mean, at least that Galaxy's Edge did get that piece right, which is there's a lot of immersive experience happening in the marketplace and everything. And then, I mean, yes, the droid experience, the lightsaber experience are significant upcharges, but they're really good experiences, and they're very immersive experiences. But you can walk around that marketplace and look at all this stuff, and just there's weird little stuff to interact with. You can go in Doc Ondar's, and I mean, I could spend half an hour in Doc Ondar's just looking at all this stuff. So there's an animatronic in the shop. They can go through the effort of putting an animatronic in a store in Galaxy's Edge, but they can't even build a store in Toy Story Land. Like, that's, I don't know. It makes me question what are their outcomes here? Like, what are they trying to accomplish with these lands now? Pandora and prior, I think everything kind of felt like it was gearing towards the same thing, which is creating an immersive experience where you have at least an e-ticket and at least one other attraction. You have food, you have shops, you have all the things in that kind of, like, it's Disney. It's a Disney park encapsulated down into one land. All the elements that make up a Disney park are within that land. But Toy Story Land really bucked that trend. And then you've got Galaxy's Edge opening without an e-ticket, and now you're going to have Avengers Campus with, like, all this weird sort of, I mean, they're putting a microbrewery in there, which is an interesting, not a bad choice, but an interesting choice in a Disney park. So, like, I guess it's making me question what a land is in Disney anymore, because I feel like that was a thing that was pretty much like when you said what goes into a land in Disney World, there are a lot of boxes there's a checklist you could go down, and now that trend has been bucked, and it kind of makes you question what it is you're going to get.
Yeah,
True.
I think that's
back to the
really
perception thing.
Like,
yeah.
Like, what are they trying to do? It's almost like they don't know. Like, when you ask, what are you trying to do with this land? Well, their answer is make money. That's like the worst answer, but that's really all they know. They don't know what they're trying to do. They're just trying to do random things to make money. And it's kind of a cheapening the experience, really. Speaking of cheapening the experience, one thing that we didn't talk about earlier today, but I don't want to talk about today, but this is going to be a bit of a preview for what's coming up next week. I want to talk about the value perception and the value equation of Walt Disney World. We talked a lot about the phased openings and what's not going to be available when Disney first opens. No character meals, no character interactions, no fireworks, no stage shows. But, if they still try to sell tickets at the same price, that drastically alters the value equation of a day at Disney. And, maybe we'll know a little bit more by next Sunday night in terms of secure circuit protocol or whatever the phased opening plans are going to be. Maybe some more information will come to light. Maybe we'll know a little bit more on timing. But I think the key question in my mind is, are people going to see any value in going to Walt Disney World when you're basically getting like half of the experiences that you should be? And what are you willing to pay for that? So, just a teaser for what's coming next week, but I want to just get everybody else's thoughts. If you guys want to continue to talk about attraction and land openings or whatever, it's 10 o'clock, but we don't have to stop now. But I did want to throw out the value perception because I think that's relevant in terms of a new land. Like, what's the value perception of Toy Story Land? I mean, you get a crappy spinner attraction, you get an off-the-shelf coaster with minimal theming, you get a bad counter-service restaurant with nowhere to sit. Like, no matter how much that cost, if that cost Disney $300 million or $200 million, whatever it costs, where's the value to the everyday guest with something like Toy Story Land? And could that money have been better spent doing something else?
That's a really good point too, especially factoring in, they absolutely jacked up prices before in advance of Galaxy's Edge, in preparation for Galaxy's Edge. I mean, ticket prices were significantly increased in both Disneyland and Disney World.
They did, because
in advance of the opening of Galaxy's Edge.
They thought people were going to come in droves to see it, and they never did. I mean, they built Grand Avenue, an entire land, to hold people waiting to get into Galaxy's Edge. There's nothing to do in Grand Avenue, and there's no point to it now because no one waits in line to go to Galaxy's Edge. So it's like they built a whole section of a park to handle a crowd that never materialized because Galaxy's Edge was so underwhelming when it first opened. I mean, how off is their prediction that they did all of that for a crowd that never materialized?
Yeah, but I think that absolutely reflects on the value.
Right. They were hoping for a Hogwarts experience, type level of crowd, and obviously Hogwarts was a completed immersive experience when it opened, and for everything, and they tried to replicate that a little bit on the cheap when they opened Galaxy's Edge. And yes, that wasn't the original plan, but that's the plan that we ended up with. And then somehow they were surprised when the droves did not appear on their doorstep.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the same hubris that allowed them to pass on Harry Potter IP to begin with.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
It almost makes you question, like, if Disney had gotten Harry Potter, what would they have done with it? Would they have done as good a job?
So bad.
Would it look like Andy's backyard?
That's why they didn't get Harry Potter. They didn't want to concede to J.K. Rowling's pretty strict requirements for what she wanted the land to be. And I think it's because Disney knows they're always going to wind up cheaping out on something at the end.
But they did it for James Cameron, though.
They were playing catch up by that point.
Yeah. Well, maybe they didn't have a choice. They had to.
True, but if you look at some of the
like, you can't cheap this out.
Yeah, and if you look at some of the concepts for what they had developed to do in Pandora, especially with the environment, there was some cutting of the lighting effects, the floor effects, the plant effects, and yes, I appreciate that they then had money to do Flight of Passage, which is an amazing ride, but wouldn't it have been amazing if the environment reacted to you as you walked through it in the way that Joe Rohde had originally described? And you saw some of the early artwork and animations and so forth. That would have blown people's minds.
It would have been about as amazing and mind-blowing as if there were free-roaming droids in Galaxy's Edge like they were supposed to be.
Yes, indeed. Which they could now do because it's not quite as crowded as they thought it was going to be, which is why originally they said they were
worried about.
Delayed.
Yeah. Yep. Yep, for sure. I forget what I was going to say now. Somebody else talk till I think of it. I know what I was going to say.
Okay.
I was just going to say we want Disney to do a good job, and we've seen Disney do a good job on some things, and it just the friction between the cash flow side of the house and the creative side of the house. Obviously, you need friction to create a fire, but sometimes it wavers, for my taste, too much towards the cash flow side, and you end up with very short-sighted, yes, you get the initial surge, but then there's nothing to do. So you've essentially wasted what money you did apply to it, when if you had even doubled that money, which is a significant investment, but then you would have had 10 years worth of people absolutely excited to come to your park instead of just a couple of years.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, I'm not a Harry Potter fan, but I think if I were a Harry Potter fan and somebody asked me today, are you happy that Universal ended up with Harry Potter Land instead of Disney? I think the answer is probably yes.
I would say yes.
I think based on what we've seen Disney do over the past 10 years, there's no way that I would want Disney to have Harry Potter Land, because it would not be the same experience. It would not be anywhere near as good as what Universal did with it. And that's funny. It reminds me of back in, I guess it was the early 90s, when Knott's Berry Farm was planning to sell itself, and the last company they wanted was Disney, and everybody said, well, they sold to Cedar Fair, and look what happened. You know, at that point, everybody said, oh, well, you should have just sold to Disney. And that probably would have been a good call for maybe 20 years. But can you imagine what Disney would be doing with Knott's Berry Farm today? I don't know. So
would it have been like Frontierland from early Disneyland? You know, mine train through Rainbow Wonderland and that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, that's still there. To Cedar Fair's credit, that's pretty much still there. Their train ride on their ancient little train, you know, and they have a pretty well executed flume ride, which was actually created by the same people that created Splash Mountain after. So, you know, I mean, Cedar Fair did some things that certainly didn't maintain the Knott's Berry Farm nostalgia of the last, you know, 50 years when they took over. But at the same time, they kept some things. Like, they knew the things that if they took out, people were going to go bananas. Like, they knew it. Disney, I don't think, knows that anymore. I think they might have known it 20 years ago. They don't know it anymore. They have no idea anymore.
Yep, agreed. Like we said at the top of the 2 hours, they are looking at tomorrow. They're looking at later this year, later this quarter, and that's probably about it.
Yeah. That's what, and I mean, that's kind of what scares me to death about Chapek, is that he's clearly only looking
at the short game,
the next couple of months, right? Like, you know, Iger did for a lot of time look in a little longer horizon, but he's not been doing that now, and Chapek has never done that. So
yeah, I mean, a lot of Iger's investments, like Star Wars and Marvel, were absolutely, and even Disney Plus, like those are all long-term things. You know, there was never an expectation that dropping a lot of money on Marvel or Star Wars was going to pay off immediately, but they seemed, and clearly have turned out to be really sound investments, at least based on box office, that have paid off. You know, and so I'm comfortable thinking that, you know, Iger wasn't that short-sighted, but it absolutely feels like the decisions that have been getting made at the parks level under Chapek have definitely been short-sighted, and this just makes me think they will continue to be.
Even some of the Star Wars movies decisions, I think people argue, have been more short-sighted. You know, but certainly the parks decisions are clearly short-sighted.
Yeah, I could make some arguments about the Star Wars. Yeah, I could make some. To me, honestly, the issue with the Star Wars film situation was not that they put out too many movies too quickly. It's that they put out too many subpar movies too quickly. If those movies had been great, no one would be complaining that there was too much Star Wars coming out.
But I mean, why were the movies not great? Because there was short-term thinking of, we got to get this out. We don't need to make it great because it's.
Well, I think there was short-term thinking
come regardless.
Yeah, I think there was short-term thinking of who they were trying to appeal to and what needed to go into a Star Wars film. You know, but I mean, in Disney's defense, they did the same thing with the prequels. The prequels weren't good. They were spaced out a little bit farther, but they weren't good either. So it's not like this is the first time that somebody tried to make a Star Wars movie and came up short.
Yeah, very true.
It's been often suggested that whenever you make a movie that's a blockbuster, it's lightning in a bottle, and episode 4 was probably lightning in a bottle. 5, a little less lightning, and then 6, the lightning was back, and ever since then they haven't really been able to capture it. But that's or at least it used to be.
The Mandalorian is the most lightning in the bottle they've been able to capture with Star Wars. Potentially,
and it's a completely different team that was allowed to do a completely different thing, and maybe there's a lesson there. You know, sequel mania is safe from a financial point of view, but On the other hand, what if you had taken the risk and gambled and made something like, oh, let's do the Marvel characters with Iron Man as kind of a storyline center character, and oh, billions of dollars later, I guess that was a good choice. But that wasn't necessarily the only choice.
But also, like that, you know, there's a very interesting difference there between what they did with Marvel and what they did with Star Wars, which was Marvel had a very complex, intertwined, long-term plan for several phases of several movies, dozens of movies. Whereas Star Wars did not have a cohesive plan from one sequel to the next. I mean, they came right out and said, oh, Director 1 wrote episode 7 and Director 2 kind of just did his own thing and half rewrote that. And then, you know, you come in with episode 9 and it's they were rewriting half of the stories from the previous movie with the next movie. There was no plan there. And so, you know, again, it's this idea that when you go in with a plan and know what experience you're trying to produce for your audience, you're going to have a whole lot better time than if you just go and do it one at a time and just, you know, let's throw this out and then let's throw the next thing out, you know. And it's kind of what they did with the lands and the difference between how successful Pandora was. Mm-hmm.
Yep. I was just going to say, yeah, that's exactly what they have done with some of the lands, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. All right. Any last thoughts from anybody on what we talked about tonight, or things that sparked in your mind that you might want to talk about in a subsequent show?
We'll get back to you.
I just think following, you know, especially this whole, you know, reopening protocol and following how that unfolds and evolves over time as, you know, the entire coronavirus situation continues to evolve and unfold over time is going to be really fascinating. You know, we're seeing different approaches to what's a good idea all over the place, but Disney is pretty unique in a lot of ways in how they're going to need to address and handle the situation. And I, you know, as all of us as Disney fans, you know, are going to be very interested and closely watching all of this. And it will be fodder for additional good discussion, I think.
Yep. What happens in Shanghai over time, for example, will be very interesting. And Georgia.
And even which park is going to open next. Yeah.
And Georgia,
is Tokyo going to open next?
Who knows?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I think that will do it for this week's episode of Pressing Issues. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. And thank you to my panelists. Very, very good discussion this week. And so you're all welcome. Be welcome back on a future episode, hopefully. But that'll do it. Thanks, everyone, for watching. And tune in next Sunday night at 8 p.m. for another episode of Pressing Issues from WDW News Today.
Night, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks. Good night.